Hello there. Today I'd like to show you a machine that I built that can make large walls out of falling blocks such as concrete powder. It can make the walls out of a solid color, which is a little bit easier to make, or it can be easily attached to a randomizer that I designed to make gradients like the one you see behind me, or even multiple gradients, like that. The basic idea behind the machine is that you will be placing blocks, which will fall down and then get pushed sideways on top of some fence gates by a slime block. And then they will hit this flying machine, at which point they fall down through an open fence gate that's being held up by this redstone block, and they'll stack up until they get to this observer. And once the observer is updated, when a concrete block appears there, the entire machine will get moved forward one, and the blocks will continue to fall into the next row. Just to give a demonstration of that in action, I have this little circuit set up. So you saw how when the last concrete block went in front of the observer, it triggered the flying machine to move forward by one. So as you can see, for a simple application, if you just wanted to do a solid color wall, like this for example, all you would need would be the pusher circuit, which is just a timer and a slime block and something to prevent you from placing the concrete too fast. And then this flying machine, which, as you can see, is pretty small. And then a line of fence gates would be the only hard thing, because you have to place solid blocks underneath the fence gates and then mine the solid blocks out in order to place them, at least in this version of Minecraft. In 1.13, I believe, they will make fence gates placeable without a solid block underneath them, which will make this a lot easier to build. So I believe with the two hoppers that I have pointing into each other for a clock on this design, it's running at 14 game ticks per block, which is not too bad. I believe the large wall, the orange and blue one you can see over there, took me about 6 hours to build. I think if you did the blocks faster, there's a chance that they can get piled up here, and they'll stick to the slime and they'll break the machine because it'll go over the push limit. But anyway, here you can see the machine in action. I just have a command block over there placing the concrete powder. So the concrete just slides along and it hits this bumper that we have and falls through the open fence gate because it doesn't have a hitbox. Now you may have noticed that every time the machine moves forward, there will be one concrete powder that will fall down through the fence gate before it closes, and then after the machine moves, if you wait for it, it'll hit this slab and pop off. And in all my testing, I've found that using this clock at least, it always drops exactly one concrete block when it moves forward. So if you were wanting to build a pattern or something with it, you could account for only one concrete block missing per run. Another thing you might notice is that the slab has to push the concrete from the observer out of the way, like that, and so it falls onto the next level. Just another thing to keep in mind if you wanted to program a pattern into this. But of course, we all know flat walls are pretty boring, and I thought that a patterned wall was too complex for me, at least at this time. So I decided to try a gradient wall. And I know some other people in the community have been building gradient-based designs, but I thought I had an idea of how to make a randomizer that's much smaller that can generate a good-looking gradient. This is the first randomizer that I came up with. It's a lot smaller than others gradient randomizers that I've seen, but it starts with this analog random number generator that I designed. So basically what it is we have at the bottom here a 4-bit binary to analog converter that I've designed, which basically we have a signal strength 15 coming in back here, and then it goes through some comparators that are in subtract mode, and if these granite blocks are extended by the pistons above, then the power level from the cauldrons and cakes will get subtracted from that to end up with a signal level over here. And so a cauldron with a fill level of 1 gives out a signal strength of 1, and then a cake with only one slice left gives out a signal strength of 2, and then this is signal strength 4, and this is signal strength 8, and so on. So we can get any binary number just using these 4 pistons extending. And then attached to that, what I have are 4 dropper randomizers here, and basically each one of them has some stackable and non-stackable items in, and droppers will pick a random item to shoot out into the hopper. So if I get a signal strength of 3, if there's a sword in there, then it'll be able to pass through to this piston. But if I get a signal strength of 1, for example, if the dead bush goes into the hopper, then because this comparator is in subtract mode, and it's subtracting 1 from this cauldron, which is at fill level 1, then it won't output anything, and it won't extend the piston. So basically, every time this redstone line is turned on by the clock back here, it will power the droppers and then lock the hoppers so that the items stay in there for a little while, which will give us enough time to extend the pistons and then process the signal out here. If you look at the flying machine here, you'll see I've modified it slightly by adding an observer here, so that every time the flying machine moves forward, this observer will trigger the redstone line on this terracotta. After I built the terracotta line, I realized it can be any solid block because it doesn't actually touch any of these slime blocks. But anyway, it will trigger this redstone line and send that signal all the way back. So the redstone line coming from that flying machine will pulse every time it moves forward, and it comes back to this dropper, which is full of snowballs, and the dropper over here is empty. So every time that the redstone line over there gets pulsed, it will send 1 snowball into this empty dropper, and then the signal strength coming out of this comparator will correspondingly increase. So now we have a random signal strength coming out of here, and a continuously increasing signal strength coming out of here. And if we subtract them, we can tell which one is larger. If the signal strength from the randomizer is larger than that of the dropper, then it will go through this repeater into this fade timer, and then turn on this piston, which will move it over. So then this line, which comes from a clock, will go to, I'll call this dispenser A, which has your starting colors in it. So immediately it's going to select for your starting colors. But then, as the signal strength increases, it's more likely to subtract all of it, and then there will be no output into this repeater, which means this fade timer over here will be off, and the piston will be retracted. And therefore it will select for dropper B over here, which is your lighter colors, or your secondary color palette, I should say. So that's pretty much all there is to it. All I have up here are 2 clocks, one that controls the randomizer turning on and off, and one that controls the droppers being triggered. So I actually had to make the clock on the randomizer slightly longer than the clock on the droppers, because this randomizer is actually kind of slow. You have to wait for stuff to go in and out of these hoppers, and wait for pistons to extend, and wait for the delay of the comparators as the signal travels along them. And so I put the randomizer, which is slower, on a 20 game tick clock, or 1 second, and then the droppers happen on an 8 game tick clock. Now, this actually could have been faster, but I was having lots of issues with lag, and if the machine dropped out too many items to the player at once, the player would place a bunch of items in a row, and it would not really look very good. On this wall you can see an example of what happened when there was a little bit of lag. I believe someone was tick warping the server, so the items were dropped out faster than the client could handle them, because the client isn't actually sped up when you do a tick warp. So got lots of long lines of blocks like this, which kind of ruined this wall. Even though the selection between the color palettes is happening a lot slower than the items are being dropped out, I don't think that it is very obvious in this gradient and in all the other walls that I've done. It looks pretty natural, actually. And there is a little bit of vertical streaking, but it's barely noticeable, and I actually kind of like that effect. So another thing that you can do with these walls that we were testing with the solid color wall is turn it directly into concrete instead of using concrete powder. As for some cases, I really like the color of concrete powder, but in other cases, it's nice to have solid concrete. So Pingu added this tiny extension with a frostwalker armor stand inside there and some sticky piston that will just pull some frosted ice behind and convert the entire thing while the machine is running. You can see it does 1 row at a time, right as the machine moves. So after doing the first wall over here, which, you know, it's not that big, and I was pretty much satisfied with the way the gradient turned out, but I wanted to do it bigger, so I built this one. And the main difference with this one, apart from being larger, is that it actually has 2 gradients. You see it goes from blue to red and orange, and then from red and orange to green and brown. So as you can see, I achieved that with the same basic randomizer circuit. The only thing I did was, once I got to the center of the gradient, where the first gradient stops, I just stopped the machine, and then changed out the color palettes. I think this one turned out even better than the first one. So after I finished this double gradient, Ray suggested that I build a gradient that goes from one color to another color and then back to the first color. And I decided to do even better than that by building a wall that has 4 gradients in it. As you can see, it goes from a purple and black color scheme to blue, and then to red and orange and yellow, and then back to blue, and then back to purple and black. And of course I didn't want to stop and start the machine 5 times. So I built a new, better and improved randomizer circuit. So as you can see with this randomizer circuit, yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on. I have the same analog randomizer, and the same subtraction circuit, and the same clocks to control it all. What I have over here is an easy way to select between multiple droppers. So we have the same line coming in from the flying machine that pulses every time that it moves forward. And I just use a repeater here to double the signal because I wanted to... The actual wall would be about 600 blocks long, but I only wanted to make it about 300 blocks long to make it easier to test. So now that I have a signal coming every time that the flying machine moves forward, I can use that to count up using the various counters I have over here. The way the multi-stage counter circuit works is that I have a dropper here, and every time that dropper is triggered, it will drop a snowball into this hopper, which will go into the next dropper. I have some pistons here that will select, using a solid block, which comparator output is sent to this line, which goes into the subtraction circuit. When the machine starts out, all the snowballs will be in this dropper, and this piston here will be retracted so that the line is not cut, and so that the redstone will power this block. Inside of here there's a repeater, which will power this dust, and power the dropper here, which will move one item through this hopper into the next dropper. And so then, the comparator signal that's selected for by this piston is being outputted into the subtraction circuit. So because we're moving all the snowballs from this dropper into the next dropper, what we want to do after this dropper is empty is then switch over so that this piston retracts and this one extends, and so that this piston extends to lock that signal and this one retracts so that the second dropper line is selected for. So the way I move the signal along once this dropper is empty is by taking a comparator output. You can see this comparator is powering this block, which powers the redstone dust on both sides. And those redstone dust extend these pistons. So once this dropper is empty, then this piston is going to retract, which then will cause the observer to power this redstone line. The redstone line comes over here through a repeater and a torch tower, which unpowers these repeaters, which are locking the other repeaters. So then that allows the signal to travel 1 over each time that it's unpowered. So you can see we're on the first one, and this piston is retracted, and this piston is extended. But if I manually update it, then you can see the second piston is selected for here, and the second piston is also selected for here. So by the time that the first dropper is empty, the second dropper will be completely full of snowballs, and that's the point at which these pistons would switch, and then the process repeats again. So this dropper will slowly drop items into the third dropper, the signal strength will increase, it's being outputted to this comparison circuit, and the next gradient will be selected for up above. So up here is what I consider to be a fairly clever way of selecting between the different gradients. So here I have 5 chests, and those represent the 4 gradients, because one gradient is going from one color scheme to another. So we have going from these two to these two to these two to these two. So the idea is we have this line, which comes from the subtraction circuit down here, like we saw on the first gradient maker. Basically that takes this fade timer, and then we have this little inverter, which will invert it some of the time if it needs to be, which I'll explain later. And then it comes up this staircase and powers an alternating set of redstone dust and torches. So when the redstone is on, every other piston is extended, but if the redstone is off, the other half of the pistons extend. So then the way we select between 2 of these is we just have some droppers over here that will drop items out into the water stream to take them to the player. And then because we have the second line selected, you see this redstone is powering this block, which powers the 2 pistons next to it. and that's extending these two blocks. And then with this alternating selector, we can select for one or the other. Since these two blocks are extended the whole time we're doing the gradient selected by these two color palettes, we have to select between those two using these alternating pistons. And these alternating pistons are the ones that are controlled by the output of that subtraction circuit down there. So here I have the system turned on, so you can see it in action. Down here I have this first stage dropper, about slightly over half full. So if we look up here, we should be selecting between these two sets of the color palette approximately evenly. And as you can see, about every iteration of the timer, it'll flip-flop between these two. So right now we're selecting for this color palette, and now we're selecting for this one. And then it'll go back to selecting for the first one in a second, just based on the random number generator. And then we can see those colors coming out into this water stream. Light colors and dark colors alternating. So one other thing that I figured out was that in order to have this alternating selection circuit work on every stage, we have to invert it some of the time. Because as you can see here, we're selecting stage 1, which means that it's selecting between these two. And by default, it's going to select for the first one, but if the redstone line turns off, it's going to select for the second one. But we have to do on the second stage, if these two are extended and the redstone line is on, then it's going to be selecting for the second one, and then go to the first one, as the redstone line turns off more often. So what I had to do down here is add this redstone line. So you see, these are the blocks that are being powered by the repeaters coming from the selection circuit over there. And those blocks are powering these two pistons on either side of them, but they also power this redstone line underneath them. So this redstone line, you can see I just ran it down so that it's not powered by this block, it's only powered by that block and this block. That redstone line comes over here to this piston, which extends the block to choose whether or not to invert the signal. So see, now we're not inverting the signal, it just comes straight from the fade timer. But if we do want to invert the signal, this will retract, and then this torch powering the repeater will send the opposite signal to this redstone line that goes up the tower. So you can see if this were off, if we were selecting for the second set, then we would have this one be the default, and then as the fade timer turns off more often, then this one will be selected for. And then the next stage, of course, that logic will invert again, and then selecting between these two, it will just be the default behavior. So another feature I added to this version of the machine was a run-in, where we'd only ever select the first color palette. As you can see on this wall, even on the second column, we were getting selections of the secondary color palette. I wanted to make it so there was a little bit of a run-in period where there was never going to be a color from the second color palette. It was always going to be selecting the first color palette. Because of the way the randomizer works, it ends up that it can actually select the second color palette even if there is no output here to subtract from, because there is a 1 in 16 chance of it generating a 0 from the randomizer. So with this, I basically just have a dropper, and if I put some snowballs into it, then it will continuously power this redstone line that goes to the alternating selection circuit, and no matter what the input from the fade timer is here, it's always going to keep this powered. And then that's just connected to the line that comes from the flying machine counter. And so every time the flying machine moves forward, it'll move one snowball out of there until it's empty. And then this circuit will not really matter anymore because the output will be 0. So while it may look complex, this randomizer is actually reasonably simple to build. And it's not that hard to make a multi-color gradient along a really long wall like this. That's not to mention that the actual wall builder itself is super simple to build. All you need are a simple flying machine, a line of fence gates, and some solid blocks and redstone for the entire length of the wall. And then, depending on what kind of randomizer you decide to use, or even the lack of a randomizer, can make it a very simple station to build at the end. Not to mention that because it works with almost all falling blocks, excepting anvils, you can include sand and gravel and dragon eggs if you really wanted to. I should mention, if you ever want to build a wall out of anvils, you have to remove this slab here, because anvils are a non-pushable block. So if you just drop an anvil in there, the machine will get stuck. While I do think that this is a pretty solid design for a wall builder in general, there are a number of issues that it has, namely the fact that it can only use falling blocks, such as concrete, sand, and gravel. This usually shouldn't be a problem, because I think that the number of colors you get from just the falling blocks is more than enough to build a wall. Concrete is a small enough palette of blocks that mix well together, so having too many colors might not make it look as good. Another issue is that it's extremely susceptible to lag. As you can see, just a few minutes of client lag caused this pattern to form, which looks really ugly compared to the rest of the wall. So if you ever plan to do this on a server or even single player, you better make sure that there isn't anything causing a lot of other lag that will make your client unresponsive for the time it takes to pick up multiple blocks of the same color. Of course, this could be combated by simply making the blocks drop out more slowly, but then your wall will take much longer to build. Another problem stems from the way the gradients are generated, specifically the way these droppers work. Because this dropper needs to start out with a signal strength of 0 and end out with a signal strength of 15, it needs to go from completely empty to completely full. And in order to do that in a linear way, you have to completely fill it with the same type of item. In this case I use snowballs. Because of this problem, it means that walls have to be a specific length, multiples of 144 for example, which is the number of snowballs you can fit into a dropper. This wall is 288 blocks long because I have two gradients that are each 144 long. There are ways to get around this. For example, on this wall, it has 4 gradients that are each 72 blocks long, and the way I did that was simply doubling the signal that happened every time the flying machine moved forward. So instead of incrementing it by 1, you can increment by 2. One idea to make walls longer would be to put in items that stack to 64 in some of the slots, and then snowballs in the rest. And this would, in theory, increase the wall length to however many items you put in here. But it may not lead to a linear increase, which could result in the wall not looking as good. You could use all sorts of timer circuits to double or triple or even quadruple the output from that flying machine, which would make it easier to make shorter gradients. But after about 72 blocks, I think that a gradient gets a little short. Personally, I think that 144 blocks is a pretty good length for a gradient, but if you happen to have a perimeter that is not a multiple of 72 or 144 blocks, it may be somewhat difficult to build a wall that is a perfect gradient along that. One idea for extending this wall so that it would fit into a perimeter is using this lead-in circuit that I made. For example, on Prototech we have a perimeter that is 600 blocks long, but in order to fit into 600 blocks, we'd have to make 4 gradients, which would be 576 blocks long. Now what we can do is use the lead-in counter to make 12 columns on the start and 12 columns at the end that are all the same color palette. That would allow us to make a gradient wall for a 600 block long perimeter, and the ends might look a little bit weird since they're not blended at all, but I think it would still look good. As you can see at the end of this wall, it was before I had implemented the machine stopping once it had finished, so it continued to go, only selecting for the secondary color palette. This is what it looks like if you have a gradient that just stops and then switches to one random color palette. Anyways, I think that's just about all I have in terms of wall builder technology for today. But I will still be working with ideas using this randomizer, perhaps for a floor builder. Goodbye.